Hello everybody, Resonance here, and today I'll be giving you all my first impressions and review of all of the remaining One Night in Karazhan cards. If you're new to Hearthstone and you'd like to support the channel, then I definitely recommend watching my Hearthstone tutorial first, link to it in the video description below. If there's one thing I really enjoy doing, it's theory crafting. So that means that my card reviews will be generally more on the optimistic side of things, in a similar style to Noxious. This is because without seeing all of the new cards, it's very difficult to accurately guess how the metagame will shift and how decks will change. So during my reviews, I'll be giving you all a combined perspective from my own opinions, the opinions of various expert players, and the overall community to help us figure out just how viable these new cards might be. If you enjoyed this video, then please let me know by leaving a like and a comment below. I appreciate the support as always. Alright, so without further ado, let's start with the first card of the day, and that's going to be Menagerie Warden. You can see on the screen a list of cards that I covered in the previous review, and I'm going to attempt to go through the long list in this video. Alright, so let's jump back into the Hearthstone client itself. The first card we're looking at is Menagerie Warden. It is a Druid class card, and it is a 6-mana 5/5 with Battle Cry. Choose a friendly beast, summon a copy of it. Well, it goes without saying that right off the bat, I think the best scenario for this card is going to be played in conjunction with Stranglethorn Tiger, a 5-mana 5/5 beast with stealth from the classic Hearthstone set of cards. This is going to be a very potent combination in my mind, and something that a lot of players have been pointing out, because you play the Stranglethorn Tiger on turn 5, and then on turn 6 you're able to play the Menagerie Warden, and your opponent is going to have a very difficult time dealing with your 5-mana 5/5 that's stealth. It will be quite difficult for them to actually remove it. Then you play the Menagerie Warden to copy the Stranglethorn Tiger, and now you have another stealth tiger. It goes without saying that Menagerie Warden doesn't need to copy a particularly big beast for it to be a strong card. It's missing approximately 3-ish points of stats if you compare it to the Boulder Fist Ogre, which is what we're going to be using as a vanilla comparison. So Menagerie Warden is missing 1 attack and 2 health, and as long as the beast that you copy has more than 3 stats, then the Menagerie Warden is going to offer a ridiculous amount of value, and that should be fairly easy to achieve. Another obvious combination with this card is going to be Druid of the Claw, because again, you can play it on turn 5, and then on turn 6, Menagerie Warden. So overall, it seems that in the upcoming Hearthstone sets, that Blizzard is really trying to push the Beast Druid archetype, and I think that Menagerie Warden is exactly the card that they need to make this happen. Mid-range Beast Druid seems like it's going to be a very strong deck in the future, and it's going to be heavily due to Menagerie Warden. Of course, combined with the Enchanted Raven, overall it just looks like Beast Druid is getting a strong set of cards, and I think that this is going to be a deck that could potentially be difficult to deal with. But the thing is that we don't really know how the metagame is going to shift, so it's certainly possible that Beast Druid just doesn't fit in. Maybe the combinations of cards are just a little bit too slow. However, I imagine this is something that people will heavily experiment with, and then it's something that could be very competitive. So if there's anything that you're going to watch out for in the upcoming set, I think Beast Druid is something to keep your eyes on. Especially because you play the Stranglethorn Tiger, you copy it the next turn, and then you can Savage Roar the turn after, and that's a ridiculous amount of damage to play around and very difficult to deal with. So it's something that I'm going to certainly be watching very carefully. And the next card on the list is going to be our good friend, Mr. Moonglade Portal. So this is also a card that I think is excellent, but it's a much more fair card, I suppose, than the Menagerie Warden. When I look at Moonglade Portal, I always ask myself, what are the values of the individual pieces of these cards combined to see if this is a good card? I think this is actually great. So if we take a look at our Healing Touch right here, this is 3 mana, restore 8 health, and then we have the Paladin spell, which I believe is called Holy Light. Yes, so this is 2 mana, restore 6 health. So right here, we have the benchmark. Restoring 6 health is worth approximately 2 mana. This is a Druid spell, of course. Restore 6 health, summon a random 6-cost minion. How much is a 6-cost minion worth? On average, a 6-cost minion is going to give you, a similar body to the Chillwind Yeti. So you're on average going to be getting something close to a 4/5 or a 5/5, which is worth approximately 4 mana. So right here, you're getting something that's a little bit better on average than a Chillwind Yeti, and you're getting Holy Light. So in the worst case scenario, Moonglade Portal is just decent. It's Chillwind Yeti and then a Holy Light on top of it, And when you combine 2 cards together, you get a lot more value than if you were just playing those 2 cards individually, because it opens up so much more space in your deck. So it's better than a Holy Light and a Chillwind Yeti. And this is assuming that your 6-cost minion doesn't happen to be that great, whereas in fact there are a lot of really crazy ones that you could get off this, such as the Cairn Bloodhoof. You get a Boulder Fist Ogre. There is so much room for value with Moonglade Portal that I imagine it's the type of card that will see some competitive play, so Menagerie Warden seems very viable, and same with Moonglade Portal. I think these are the type of cards that you can just kind of put in your deck. I feel like with Menagerie Warden, though, you'd probably end up putting it in a Druid deck that you don't necessarily need to run all the beasts in the game for it to be good, but you'll want to run a good amount. Whereas with Moonglade Portal, perhaps it just fits into an existing Druid archetype. It just seems like a decent card in general. So moving on to the next card, we have already taken a look at Kindly Grandmother. So let's take a look at the Cloaked Huntress. This is a very powerful card as well, in my opinion. So we have a 3-mana 3/4 Hunter card, and it has the text that says, "Your secrets cost 0." That is actually a very strong ability, but I don't think this card is as game-breaking as it might seem at a glance. 3-mana 3/4 is, generally speaking, going to be premium stats. It allows you to trade with basically all 2-mana minions, and then, you're able to live to attack again, because all 2-mana minions are generally going to be 3/2s or 2/3s, so 3/4 is an excellent stat line. If it was a 4/3, then it would run the risk of being killed by 3/2 2-mana minions, such as the Huge Toad, for example. So I would say that Cloaked Huntress has pretty good stats. Its ability, Your Secrets Cost 0, is very, very strong, especially when we look at the state of secrets in general. So if we just look at the list of Hunter secrets, we'll find that as a class, Hunters are generally the ones that are playing secrets the most, at least in the current metagame, when things like Mad Scientists have sort of phased out. Mage secrets, generally we don't see as many of them in competitive Hearthstone these days. Same with Paladin secrets. They're just not as good on their own as they used to be. Especially like the Secret Paladin deck is a little bit weaker than it used to be, although it is actually still decently viable in the current meta. Hunter secrets are just probably the strongest on their own, mostly because if you're playing Mage secrets, it's really difficult to commit yourself to just spending 3 mana during a turn without having a way to cheat it out. And same thing with the Paladin secrets, they're generally very low value, and it takes a card like Mysterious Challenger to really push these into viability. So overall, I think this card is actually quite strong, because Freezing Trap, for example, Explosive Trap, these are the type of things that you would kind of be running anyway, and Eaglehorn Bow is just kind of a staple of Hunter decks. It's always been a staple of Hunter decks. Even if you don't necessarily proc the secret, it's still, 3-mana 3/2 weapon is actually very decent. So Cloaked Huntress kind of just fits into these pretty well. I think, though, that this card isn't super game-breaking, though, because one of the biggest problems with Hunter as a class in general is that they just don't have that much card draw. Their card draw cards are very weak, and for the most part they have cards that just add random beasts to their hand, for example. We see that with things like Web Spinner and then Infest, the current standard version of that. So Hunters have like alternate ways of filling their hand rather than just drawing cards, and this means that, in general, you're probably not going to get too many free secrets off of Cloaked Huntress. If anything, you play a secret on turn 2 where you play another minion like the King's Elec, and then on turn 3, it's very difficult for you to actually get too much value out of Cloaked Huntress. In fact, you might actually have to end up tailoring your deck to make Cloaked Huntress really strong, and then it just remains to be seen exactly how strong a secret-based Hunter would be. Where you're running, rather than like 2 secrets like standard, you might run up to 4. One crazy thing with this card, though, is that it synergizes extremely well with Lock and Load. Lock and Load is a 2-mana Hunter spell that says, each time you cast a spell this turn, add a random Hunter card to your hand. So you can kind of chain a near-infinite loop of Lock and Load. I mean, it's not near-infinite, but you can certainly extend the duration of Lock and Load by a lot more than you normally could because of Cloaked Huntress, because every time Lock and Load gives you a secret, you can play it for 0, and then that counts as another spell cast for Lock and Load, and the cycle continues. So overall, that's pretty strong. It's worth noting that this card is also a common, so in Arena, you're going to see a reasonable amount of it. Same thing with Menagerie Warden, and overall, this minion just has good stats. So this is a cool card that I look forward to experimenting with. It certainly appears that it could be viable, and whether or not it actually turns out to be a competitive card just depends on how strong a Hunter deck can be if they're running additional secrets, and whether or not they're able to reliably use Cloaked Huntress' ability. And now we're moving on to the next card, which is going to be the Cat Trick. So, Cat Trick is a 2-mana Hunter Secret. So this is something that you would definitely want to play with Cloaked Huntress. And what it reads is, after your opponent casts a spell, summon a 4/2 Panther with Stealth. So the Panther that you're going to be summoning is the Jungle Panther right here, which is actually a classic Hearthstone card, which you can play right now. So essentially with Cat Trick, it's a conditional Jungle Panther that you're paying a 1-mana discount for. So that's actually really good. You can compare it to the current Hunter Trap that we have called Bear Trap right here, which is summons another 3-mana minion for 2 mana. So overall, Cat Trick I expect to be a decent secret. It's certainly much stronger with Cloaked Huntress because they play Cloaked Huntress, and then they also plot down a Cat Trick. Your opponent will then try to remove it with something like, a Fireball or whatever. Then the Cloaked Huntress dives, and then now the Cat Trick summons the Panther, so your opponent still has a board that he has to deal with. The thing with Cat Trick, though, is that it might not necessarily be the strongest competitive card. It really depends on the metagame. This is a heavily metagame-dependent card. Why? Because it really just doesn't do very much in the matchups versus decks where your opponents just don't cast that many spells. Particularly the Zoo Warlock that runs a lot of weak early game minions like Flame Imp, for example, and they run things like Voidwalker and then just buff those cards up with Power Overwhelming, Abusive Sergeant, etc. That kind of deck is going to be really good versus decks that run Cat Trick, because the Warlock isn't just going to be playing that many spells. So something you have to be conscious of is that Cat Trick is going to be a metagame-dependent card, where while the Stealth makes it very difficult to deal with, if your opponents aren't running that many spells, then Cat Trick won't be that strong of a card. Moving on, we have Medivh's Valet, which is going to be a 2-mana Mage minion. So Medivh's Valet is a 2-mana, 2/3 for Mage. This is Battle Cry. If you control a secret, deal 3 damage. Overall, I actually think this card is great, and I am very excited to play around with this one. Because we were talking about this earlier, where Hunter Secrets are just at that perfect amount of mana where you don't sacrifice that much tempo for playing them, and they tend to have very tempo-oriented effects like Freezing Trap. They're just strong on their own. And Mage spells are almost good enough. They've seen fringe competitive play, and they saw a lot of competitive play when Mad Scientist was in Standard, and now that we have Medivh's Valet, I think that there might be something here. I think the most obvious secret that you would want to play with Medivh's Valet is Ice Block, because Ice Block just stays in play until you die. And this means that you get to consistently proc Medivh's Valet's Battle Cry throughout the entire game. Obviously, of course, Medivh's Valet has as good synergy with Ice Block as, say, Ethereal Arcanist, which has always been in the game since the classic Hearthstone set. So it's possible that there could actually be something here. It's a common, so in Arena, 2-mana, 2/3 is certainly decent, and you're less likely to get it off. But in Constructed, maybe there's something you can do with this. And in Arena, maybe this shifts the way you draft a bit, and you start thinking more about whether or not you want to run some secrets. They didn't release any additional Mage secrets in this particular set, but the existing ones are decent enough. Mirror Entity on its own is a pretty strong Mage secret, so we could see something. Maybe you run Counterspell. Overall, I think Medivh's Valet has some competitive potential. It's just a little bit awkward because if you play it on turn 2, it's all right, but it's not constructed strong enough. You're not going to play a vanilla 2-mana 2/3 in ranked constructed Hearthstone, and then you have to play the secret the next turn. So it's a little bit awkward to play this thing on curve, but overall, this card has potential. So I will certainly experiment with that. I've already seen Firelands Portal, and I covered Babbling Book in the previous part as well. So we're going to move on to the Nightbane Templar. This is also a cool card. I think overall Blizzard has been stepping up their card design, and this is one that I would also like to experiment with. So, Nightbane Templar, it's a 3-mana Paladin card. It's a 3-mana 2/3 that says, Battle Cry, if you're holding a dragon, summon 2 1/1 whelps. So, without the dragon, you're getting a 3-mana 2/3, which is absolutely awful, so it must have powerful text. In this case, it would have no text if you're not holding a dragon, so it's going to be really bad if you're not. Good news is that you'll be able to fairly consistently proc this ability if your deck contains a lot of dragons, which is what you're going to be doing. This is not the type of Paladin card that you just slap into your Paladin deck, because if you don't proc the ability, it's awful. And if you're running, like, 8, 9 plus dragons, then you should be able to proc this semi-reliably. How good is it if you get the ability? You can sort of consider it to be like a 3 mana 4/5, which is actually very good. So it's like a 3 mana Chillwind Yeti, which is the card that we were just looking at earlier, and that turns out to be some pretty sick value. After all, dragon decks are all about getting to the late game to play, or at least they were originally about this idea where you try and play some overstated minions early to start playing some crazy strong, huge dragons later on in the game and just win from there. This is comparable to the card Blackwing Technician. There's a 3 mana 2/4, so it has better stats if you don't proc the battle cry, but overall Nightbane Templar offers you more bodies and slightly more attack than the Blackwing Technician if you're able to proc the ability. How good is that? Well, it's actually very good versus aggressive decks compared to Blackwing Technician. Perhaps one of the main weaknesses of the slower control-style dragon decks is that they don't perform very well versus like the Zoo Warlock and all sorts of other very aggressive decks, because you're only putting down like 1 threat a turn, and they can either just trade up by abusing Power Overwhelming, or they can just go face. Whereas if you have Nightbane Templar, you've got 3 bodies on the board, which allows you to deal with the Zoo token minions a lot easier than you would be if you were playing Blackwing Technician. Is this enough to push the Dragon Paladin into viability? It's difficult to know. Like, Dragon Consort is what carries Dragon Paladin archetype, and right now it's just a little bit subpar. Everyone thought it would be insane initially, so I always try to keep an open mind. And it just turns out that Dragon Consort is actually just not good enough, and that they just needed more Dragon synergy to make this happen. Nightbane Templar might be enough. It's just worth noting that the 3 mana slot for Paladin is already, at least somewhat competitive, because you already have things that, like Elder Peacekeeper, which is sort of an auto-include, so it's difficult to know. I remember that, I believe it was Tice who said that the effect might not be strong enough compared to Menagerie Warden to really push the Dragon Paladin archetype, but it remains to be seen. It certainly has some potential, and this is a decent card in its own right. Is it strong enough? We'll find out. Moving on to Silvermoon Portal. So Silvermoon Portal is a 4 mana Paladin spell. Give a minion +2/+2, summon a random 2-cost minion. 2 mana minions are generally decent. We've already been playing around with the idea in Piloted Shredder, so on average you're sort of getting close to a 2/2 minion, and then the give a minion +2/+2 is generally also worth around 2 mana. So in a vacuum, this card is not super great if you just look at the individual parts, because you're not really getting a huge discount or anything. Because it's not like you're going to be playing a 2 mana 2/2 that often. And give a minion +2/+2 is again worth like a little less than 2 mana, because you compare it to something like Mark of the Wild, for example, which gives a minion +2/+2 and taunt. So Silvermoon Portal isn't necessarily the king of value, but it's just a very decent card overall. I think that the biggest drawback for this, because again, you can't just evaluate the individual parts individually. You have to look at it as the combined package. When you combine 2 cards together, it opens up so many more slots in your deck, making Silvermoon Portal a decent consideration. I don't think, though, that this card will be that competitive. I would love to be wrong, and it remains to be seen what the metagame is like. The reason, though, I don't think this card will be that competitive is because there are actually just way too many excellent 4 mana Paladin cards. They have like the most crowded 4 mana slot, I think, out of all the classes in the game, and this is even evident if you're a super new player and you only had access to the classic cards. You've got things like Consecration, Keeper of Uldaman, you have the Murloc Knight, True Silver Champion, like the list goes on and on and on. There's Blessing of Kings. You have so many strong 4 mana Paladin cards in addition to just 4 mana minions. So I think that you're going to have a lot of trouble finding room in your deck for Silvermoon Portal. It does have some spell synergy, but overall I think that this card is going to be decent in Arena. But in Constructed, it's going to have some trouble finding a home. Alright, so we've already seen Ivory Knight. Moving on to Purify. This is a card that has been very controversial throughout the Hearthstone community. One that stirred up a huge outcry, and one of the reasons why I wanted to wait a little bit before I did this card review, just to wait for everything to settle down. So this is a Priest spell. We're moving on to the Priest cards. Purify is a 2-mana priest card that says, silence a friendly minion, draw a card. Oh my. It's worth noting that recently, due to community pressure, that the Hearthstone dev team under Ben Brode has decided to make sure that Purify does not appear in the arena. So all the Cthulhu cards do not appear in your arena drafts, and neither does Purify. So even though this is a common card and would destroy arena balance if it was released in arena, because you can't possibly draft for synergy where the silence of friendly minion isn't necessarily a bad thing, that's too unreliable when you're drafting a deck in arena. So this card would have destroyed arena balance, and I'm really, really glad that they decided to make it undraftable. I think it's an excellent decision. So I'm mostly just going to be talking about it from a constructive perspective, because Purify, like I said, you can't draft for synergy where you build like a Purify arena deck. That's too unreliable. Let's talk about this card more from just constructed then. So in constructed, you'd want to be running this card where the silence of friendly minion isn't such a huge drawback. So you would be playing it on minions with negative text. So let's go take a look at a few of those. Ancient Watcher is, I think, one of the more obvious, like, traditional classic Hearthstone cards that I think is really cool and encourages weird deck building. I like this card a lot. You play Purify on it, and now have a 4/5 that can attack, and you just drew a card. I think a lot of players are making a mistake, though, when they're evaluating Purify. Whereas I do think that this card is actually very bad, but I don't think it's nearly as bad as people think it is. Isn't that reassuring? Oh, it's bad, but it's not that bad. And let's talk about why it's not that bad. You can't necessarily compare Purify plus Ancient Watcher to that 4-mana 4/5 Chillwind Yeti that we've been talking about, because it doesn't really work that way. I know that you're spending 4 mana to get a 4/5, but think about it this way. You play the Ancient Watcher on turn 2, and then you play Purify on turn 3. So now you have a 4/5 that can attack on turn 3, which you just can't do with a Chillwind Yeti. So you can't directly compare those two, and I think a lot of players are just making that mistake, hopping on the bandwagon, rather than keeping an open mind and just kind of looking at these cards in more realistic situations. I think that's one decent way to look at it, and it's evidence that this card is not particularly great, but it's not exactly a crappy Chillwind Yeti. It's still crappy, though. You're doing it over 2 turns, and you draw a card. It can attack as early as turn 3, and if there's any class that can abuse these overstated bodies early on, it's probably going to be Priest, because Priest can just heal them up and they just stick on the board. Another thing that is really good with this card is, well, not necessarily really good, but this is the synergy you're looking for when you're building your Purify deck, is you're looking at cards like Eerie Statue as well, which can't attack either unless you silence them. And then in the worst case scenario, this is what, like a 6-mana 7/7 then, which is actually not very good, or a 4-mana 7/7 Overload 2, so it's your Flame Wreath Faceless, except it cost you 2 cards. But hey, at least you drew one. Overall, Purify, not so great. And the main reason behind that is because, frankly, it's just overcosted. This is a very difficult card to balance, and Ben Brode talked a lot about this in his actual video, in that if you made it 1 mana, then a lot of people are just going to run it for the fact that it cycles itself, and as it's a good way to thin your deck out. And you don't really want people doing that. Then dangerous combo decks start to become way too consistent when there are all sorts of like 1-mana cantrips that can draw you cards. So you have to be really careful about that. The thing is, though, is this card is absolute balls, because silencing a friendly minion is going to be a drawback, and you would, in most cases, and drawing a card is certainly not worth 2 mana. Drawing a card is worth like 1.5 mana. Why do we know this? Because we have Arcane Intellect, which is 3 mana, draw 2 cards. So with Purify, you have to deal with the downside, and then you're overpaying for drawing a card. And this is unless you're building a deck where the downside's not really a downside, and that's the whole point. It's just that there aren't enough synergy cards with Purify yet to make this archetype really work. Especially considering that this isn't necessarily a new archetype. Silence has always existed in Hearthstone since the classic set. This is a 0-mana silence minion, and you're able to use this on enemy minions as well. And again, Blizzards be really careful about allowing you to cheaply silence enemy minions, because we've seen in the past that it's a very unfun mechanic and something that they've really toned back on. So this is a difficult card to balance. Silence Priest has already been experimented with and just turned out to not be so great, so it would only be good from the redundancy factor of Purify, since you have access to 2 ways to silence your minions, and at least one of them can go offensively. So maybe this is something that pops up eventually. I think it's going to be more of a fun deck, and I think it's okay that they release cards that are more on the fun side rather than extremely competitive. Because this is the type of card that I like experimenting with. It might be a little bit too weak, though. I'd like to win every now and then. So that's Purify. Overall, this card I don't think we'll see any competitive play in this set, and it might in the future. But overall, it seems really, really weak. Moving on, we have Priest of the Feast. This is a card that Brian Kibler happens to be a huge fan of, and it's one that I think that people are really sleeping on. A 4-mana 3/6 body is incredibly abusable if you were playing Priest because your hero power allows you to heal 2 health. So you want a body that has just enough attack, like this does, where you can kill all the weaker minions that your opponents played in the previous turns, and then enough health that you can keep spamming heals on it. I think that this is actually a very strong card. It's common, so it's going to show up in Arena a lot, which will hopefully help out the Arena Priests a bit, which right now Priest is one of the weakest, if not the weakest, Arena class by a decent margin. It's also not particularly strong in the current constructed metagame. Priest of the Feast might help with that, only because Priest doesn't actually have that many excellent healing options that are attached to utility cards. So if we compare it to, for example, Ragnar's Lightlord is an excellent healing card because it restores 8 health, but it also has a body. And that's what I really like about Priest of the Feast, is that it allows you to heal yourself and then also put some presence on the board. Priests run a lot of very situational spells, and this allows them to sustain themselves while putting some pressure on their opponents. So overall, I think this is actually a fairly decent card and something that Priest actually kind of needed. The major downside of this card, though, is going to be its mana cost, as the 4-mana slot for Priest is actually reasonably crowded. I mean, Holy Champion is already a decent Priest card. You know, we have things like Octnoir Soul Priest, which is in a lot of Priest decks, and we even have Hooded Acolyte, for example, things like Shadow Madness, Shifting Shade. There are plenty of 4-mana Priest cards. Might be a little bit tricky to find a home for this in your Priest decks, but I imagine that people will experiment with it. Especially since we have things like Shadow Word Pain, Shadow Word Death, for example. Overall, I think that Priest of the Feast is a decent card to keep your eye on. The effect is quite nice. I mean, it could even help swing the Freeze Mage matchup in favor of the Priest players, or at least make it a little bit less one-sided, as it's funny because Priest just has some difficulty sustaining itself and staying alive, since it has such a weak early game that it usually just gets pummeled down and dies. So Priest of the Feast should help a lot with that. Moving on to the next card, we have Onyx Bishop. I actually think Onyx Bishop is also great, and something that I think players are undervaluating a bit. Overall, this card is pretty decent. You can kind of think of it as a 3-mana 3/4 with a Resurrect attached on top of it. Resurrect is a really cool card that hasn't really seen that much competitive play, but it's one of those cards that I always encourage players to experiment with, and one of these days, it could really find a home in a competitive deck. Resurrect is a very powerful effect. Summon a random friendly minion that died this game. Onyx Bishop, you get a 3-mana 3/4 body. It's 5-mana 3/4, but you get the 2-mana spell on top of it. And remember, when you combine the 2 spells, you end up getting a better card than you would if you were running those 2 things separately. So Onyx Bishop is pretty great. I think a lot of people have said that they wish the stats were a little bit better, the mana cost was a little bit lower, but then I feel like the card might be bonkers. One thing that I think a lot of players discount when they're evaluating cards, and something I try to be really careful of, is this whole redundancy factor. Same thing with Purify, now with Onyx Bishop. One of the problems with Resurrect is you couldn't really consistently get it off and then still impact the board enough. You kind of had to play Resurrect and then something else. Whereas with Onyx Bishop, you're getting the body on the board and you're resurrecting something. And now you have 2 effects that allow you to summon a friendly minion that died this game. So maybe we're getting to the point where redundancy is good enough that a Resurrect Priest could actually be viable. Overall, this card seems very decent. It's also going to be quite strong with Barnes, the card that I mentioned in the previous card review. Barnes is a 4-mana 3/4 legendary that has Battlecry. Summon a 1/1 copy of a random minion in your deck. So this means that you could pull a really strong minion like Ragnaros or Sylvanas off of Barnes. So again, Barnes summons a 1/1 copy of a minion in your deck. So you get this guy, he comes as a 1/1 from Barnes, and then this Ragnaros dies, and then you play Onyx Bishop the next turn, and now you have a full 8/8 Ragnaros the Firelord. Similarly, you can also purify the tokens that Barnes summons, or the tokens that Herald Volage summons, because he also summons 1/1 tokens, which is kind of cute, but probably not good enough. Onyx Bishop, though, I think could see competitive play. Same thing with Priest of the Feast. So overall, I don't think Priest got shafted as hard as the other classes. It's just a shame that Purify really doesn't have that much potential at this present point in time. Alright, moving on, we've got the Swash Burglar. So, I remember that Tice thinks that this card is great, and this is a card as well that I think people might be sleeping on a little bit. Swash Burglar is a 1-mana, 1/1 rogue card. And it says Battlecry, add a random class card to your hand from your opponent's class. So that can kind of be compared to a 1-mana, 1/1 Battlecry draw card. It's worth noting, though, that this is better than like adding a random spell or something to your hand, because class cards are generally slightly better than neutral cards. So overall, this is actually quite decent in its own right. And the main reason that you would run Swash Burglar is because, you know, you're running a deck that probably contains the Ethereal Peddler card, which we covered in the previous review. So overall, I actually think that Swash Burglar actually might make Ethereal Peddler consistent enough. And I also neglected to mention in the previous card review that the Ethereal Peddler has synergy with a couple other cards I didn't mention. For one, Nexus Champion Sarad, which is a 5-mana 4/5, Inspire, add a random spell to your hand, so this whenever you use your hero power, and then Grand Crusader, add a random Paladin card to your hand. And then we also have Nefarian. So there's certainly enough here that the Ethereal Peddler Rogue archetype might actually be good enough, so it's something to certainly keep your eye on. I actually think at this point I'm probably going to cover the neutral cards in a separate video, and then just go through the class cards right now. Otherwise the parts will be way too long. Swash Burglar seems decent. It's also a pirate, which is something you can't really neglect considering how much pirate synergy there is floating around out there. So overall, I think this is a decent card that could see some competitive play. 1-mana, 1/1 draw card is great, and then 1-mana, 1/1 add a random class card to your hand is really good. It's at least almost as good, if not better, just depends on the circumstances, and with the Ethereal Peddler, then it's certainly better. So, something to keep your eye on. This card might even be playable without Ethereal Peddler, but I think it's something that people will experiment with a lot in the coming adventure. I mean, we look at Undercity Huckster, and once again, I think that Swash Burglar, especially since the battle cry, is pretty good. Moving on, we've got Deadly Fork. Gotta admire Blizzard for their sense of humor. Deadly Fork is a decent rogue card, so I think Swash Burglar will see some competitive play, or at least some experimentation. Deadly Fork is probably a little bit weaker than Swash Burglar, but it's difficult to tell. So this is a 3-mana, 3/2 rogue minion with Death Rattle, add a 3/2 weapon to your hand. So once the Deadly Fork dies, Valera picks it up and starts stabbing people with it, which is great. The strength of this card, though, heavily depends on how much the 3/2 weapon that you get added to your hand costs, because again, you have to play it again. If you equipped it, then this card would be absolutely bonkers. Good news is you have to pay for it. Bad news is it costs 3 mana. Good news is I think people are sleeping on this card as well, because when we look at Paladin cards such as Rallying Blade, which is, it's a 3-mana, 3/2 weapon, and it has the battle cry, but even if the battle cry doesn't go off, people still sometimes play this card anyway. And we were looking earlier at the Eagle Horn Bow for Hunter, and it's generally the same situation, that a 3-mana, 3/2 weapon is pretty good. Oh no. Alright, let me try that again. A 3-mana, 3/2 weapon is actually pretty good. People look at Fiery War Axe and they're like, well, why would you ever play a 3-mana, 3/2 weapon? Because Fiery War Axe exists and it's a 2-mana, 3/2 warrior weapon. It just turns out that Fiery War Axe is actually just ridiculous, and that you would probably play a 3-mana, 3/2 weapon anyway. I think that this card is decent. I don't think that you put it in an Unearthed Raptor rogue deck, but overall I think it's decent. It looks like BattleNet has actually died, so I picked a really awkward time to do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to cut the video here, and then I'm going to go over all of the remaining class cards and then the neutral cards. I think Blizzard's getting DDoSed or something. So I'm going to end it off here, do one more part of this, post that on YouTube. As always, thank you so much, guys, for the support. I hope you've really been enjoying the card review series so far. This is one of my favorite things to do. And as I'm trying to diversify the channel, have some fun, and just continue sticking around on YouTube, you guys have been incredibly helpful with the process, so I appreciate it. I understand that Hearthstone isn't for everybody, so I would like to do some other stuff on the side as well. And overall, I see bright things in the future. So again, thank you guys for sticking around. Hopefully you enjoy this. If you do, share your support. That way I can stick around on YouTube, keep doing my thing. And I'm really looking forward to playing with these cards. So I'll see you all next time. As soon as Blizzard servers come back up, we're going to look at the remaining cards in the set. So we got Shaman, Warlock, and Warrior, I think. And then just the neutral cards. So we'll be right back. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all shortly. You can find everything you need in the video description below.